You're not welcome here, and I'll make sure you know it. Kama stood frozen at the front of the classroom, the sharp sting of humiliation slicing through her. The buzz of chatter around her seemed to fade as her fingers instinctively brushed over the strands of her hair. In a room full of whispering eyes, she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like 1,000 tons of concrete. She had spent hours that morning perfecting her braids, each twist and turn a part of her heritage, a part of her identity. But now, those braids felt like a target, a symbol of something she couldn't escape. Kama, Mr. Parker's voice sliced through the silence, a venomous edge to it. Get to the front of the class. She hesitated. She'd been here before. The whispered comments, the snide remarks about her hair, her skin, her very presence. But this time felt different. This time, it wasn't just the students. The teacher, the one supposed to protect and guide her, had taken it upon himself to assert dominance in the most brutal way possible. Kama didn't move, not right away. But Mr. Parker's cold stare bore into her, compelling her to step forward. Do I need to repeat myself? His voice was low, threatening. Her heart pounded as she walked to the front. There, she could see it. His eyes, cold and calculating. His lips twisted in a sneer. The scissors in his hands glinted in the harsh overhead light. Kama, he said again, his tone now mocking. It seems that your hair is distracting the other students. Perhaps we need to do something about it. The class went quiet, and all she could hear was the pulse of blood rushing to her ears. She had a choice. She could fight, but how could she win when the person supposed to protect her was the one wielding the scissors? He took a step closer. Perhaps a more appropriate hairstyle is in order. Don't you think? Before she could react, he snipped a lock of her braid. Without permission, without warning. The sound of the scissors cutting through her hair was deafening. Kama's heart dropped. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. But inside, everything shattered. The weight of his action crushed her. This wasn't just about hair. This was about control, power, and the cruel message that her very identity was unwelcome here. But something shifted inside her in that moment. She felt her spine straighten, her fists clench. This wasn't the end of her story. She wouldn't let it be. What will Kama do next? Will she stay silent, or will she find the strength to fight back? The next chapter holds the answer. Keep reading, because no one deserves to be humiliated. Not like this. They can't do this to you, Kama. Her father's words echoed in her mind as she sat in the car, staring blankly out the window. Her hair, now a mess of uneven braids and loose strands, felt foreign, like a part of her had been ripped away. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Yet, as her dad drove her home, she could feel something stirring inside her, something that refused to stay quiet. Kama had always been taught to respect authority, to keep her head down, work hard, and never cause trouble. But after today, after what Mr. Parker had done, that respect was gone, and so was the fear. Her father's voice, low but determined, broke through her thoughts. Kama, you don't have to fight this alone. They pulled into the driveway of their modest home, the one place where she always felt safe. But now, even here, the weight of what happened felt suffocating. She didn't want to tell him what had happened. She didn't want to admit to the humiliation, but she knew she had no choice. Dad, he cut my hair, Kama whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't need to ask who he was. Kama had always spoken of Mr. Parker with a mix of respect and wariness. The thought of that teacher, of the power he wielded, had always made her uneasy, but now the ugly truth was clear. He had no right to do that, Kama. Her father's voice was firm, colder than she had ever heard it before. No right to treat you like that. Before Kama could respond, her father was already out of the car, his jaw set. He didn't say a word as he marched to the door, but Kama knew exactly where he was headed. To the school. To confront the people who had allowed this to happen. The powerlessness she had felt began to shift. Her father was a quiet man, one who kept to himself, but when it came to his daughter, when it came to injustice, he was a force to be reckoned with. He had always been her protector, and today, she would need him more than ever. Kama followed her father into the house, her thoughts racing. She had spent her whole life trying to make peace with the world around her, trying to blend in. But now, everything had changed, and she couldn't just sit back and hope it would go away. This was no longer about hair. It was about respect. It was about standing up when the world tried to tear you down. What will happen when Kama's father faces the school board? Will they listen, or will they sweep it under the rug? The next chapter will reveal the answer. Keep reading, because Kama's fight is just beginning. We will not stand by and let this happen again. Kama's father stood in the principal's office, his posture rigid with determination. The principal, a portly man in his 50s with thinning hair, looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat as he tried to avoid meeting her father's fiery gaze. Behind him, Mr. Parker sat at the far end of the room, his face a mask of indifference, as if he were completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. "Mr. Lewis," the principal began, his voice shaking slightly, "I understand your concerns, but—" "There's no but," her father interrupted. "You and I both know that my daughter did nothing wrong. But you, Mr. Parker, you humiliated her. And this," he gestured toward the unkempt braids, still visible even though she had tried to fix them herself, "this is the result of your actions." Mr. Parker finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. "I was simply trying to discipline her, Mr. Lewis. She was being disruptive in class." "Disruptive?" Kama's father growled. "She was being herself. You're not here to control her, especially not her hair. That's personal." Kama stood in the doorway, feeling every eye on her as her father continued. He was fearless, relentless, and she found herself feeling braver with each word he spoke. "And what exactly made you think you had the right to take a pair of scissors to my daughter's hair, Mr. Parker?" her father demanded. Mr. Parker's eyes narrowed, his arrogance turning into a cold, calculated defense. She was violating the school dress code. The length of her braids was a distraction to the other students. Kama's heart raced as her father scoffed at the excuse. "Dress code? That's what this is about. You're using rules to justify making my daughter feel less than human?" There was a tense silence in the room as everyone waited for the principal to intervene. But instead, he just sat back in his chair, his face pale. This wasn't the first time he had been confronted about Mr. Parker's behavior, and it seemed he was hoping the issue would just disappear. But Kama's father wasn't about to let that happen. "I'm going to the school board," he said, his voice low but resolute. "And I'll make sure they know exactly what happened here. I'll make sure they understand that this is not about rules. This is about respect. My daughter deserves to be treated with dignity, and you will not sweep this under the rug." Mr. Parker opened his mouth to argue, but her father was already turning away, dragging Kama with him. "You don't have to be afraid, Kama," her father whispered as they walked out the door. "You've got me." As the door slammed behind them, Kama's heart beat wildly in her chest. For the first time in her life, she felt like someone was really fighting for her. Like someone saw her for who she truly was, not just for the color of her skin or the way she wore her hair. The fight had only just begun. What will happen when the school board hears this case? Will they side with Kama, or will they protect Mr. Parker? The next chapter will show the explosive aftermath. Keep reading. Kama's story is far from over. You're not just fighting for yourself anymore, Kama. You're fighting for every kid who's ever been silenced. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Kama couldn't shake the nervous knot in her stomach. Her father had been preparing her, but nothing could quite prepare her for the reality of what was about to happen. The boardroom was a sea of unfamiliar faces, parents, administrators, and a handful of community leaders. At the front, a long polished table stretched across the room, with the board members seated like judges, their expressions stern and impassive. Kama and her father entered the room, the eyes of everyone in the room turning toward them. Kama tried to hold her head high, but the weight of their stares was suffocating. Her father's hand gently rested on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. He had always told her that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, but about standing tall even when your knees shook. A woman sitting at the far end of the table, presumably the chairwoman, cleared her throat. "Mr. Lewis, Ms. Lewis," she said in a voice that could only be described as mechanical. We've called you here today to discuss the matter regarding your daughter's treatment by Mr. Parker. We're here to hear both sides of the issue. Kama's heart skipped a beat. Was this going to be a fair hearing? Or was it just a formality to make them look like they were doing the right thing? Her father stepped forward, the room quieting at his presence. He spoke with authority, every word measured and deliberate. I'm here because my daughter was humiliated in front of her peers. She was punished for nothing more than trying to express herself. She didn't break any rule. She didn't disrupt anything. Mr. Parker did not have the right to take scissors to her hair. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. This isn't just about a pair of scissors, her father continued, his voice rising. It's about dignity. It's about respect. You cannot allow this man to get away with what he did, and you cannot let other children think that this kind of behavior is acceptable. Kama stood beside her father, her hands clasped in front of her, but her voice was the one that surprised everyone in the room. I didn't deserve what happened, she said, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. Mr. Parker humiliated me in front of everyone, and I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not a problem. I'm just a kid who wanted to wear my hair the way I've always worn it. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for him to cut it. Her words hit the room like a shockwave, the silence thickening as people shifted in their seats, unsure of how to respond. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, leaned forward. But Ms. Lewis, surely you understand that we have dress codes for a reason. We need to maintain some order, some level of discipline. Kama's father didn't let him finish. This isn't about discipline. This is about control. You're teaching kids that their worth is tied to their appearance, that their self-expression doesn't matter. How is that teaching them respect? Another board member, a woman with glasses, turned to the chairwoman, exchanging a glance. We may need to review the policies. This is not an isolated incident, is it? She asked, her tone more reflective now. The room buzzed with murmurs, as if the tide were shifting. Kama felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they would listen. Maybe they would stand up for what was right. The chairwoman tapped her pen on the table, her expression unreadable. We will deliberate. We will get back to you with our decision. Kama and her father exchanged a glance. Her father gave her a small, reassuring smile, but she could see the fire in his eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As they walked out of the boardroom, Kama couldn't help but feel a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had spoken her truth, and no matter what happened next, she knew she had made a difference. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about every student who had ever been silenced, every kid who had ever been told they didn't belong. Kama was ready to fight for them too. What will the school board decide? Will they take action against Mr. Parker, or will they side with the status quo? The next chapter is sure to bring a turning point. Keep reading to find out what happens next in Kama's fight for justice. Sometimes, standing up means standing alone, but not always. Kama paced back and forth in her bedroom, her mind racing with thoughts of the board meeting. It had been 3 days since her father, and she had laid everything on the line. 3 days since she had stood before those powerful people and spoken the truth. And now, all they could do was wait. Her father had remained calm and composed, but Kama knew he was just as anxious as she was. The uncertainty was eating at him. The silence was worse than any judgment they could give her. It was as if the decision was hanging in the air, like an unspoken verdict that could drop at any moment. Her phone buzzed on the bed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her best friend, Tasha. Tasha, they still haven't decided yet. How are you holding up? Kama stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to tell Tasha everything, to let her know that the pressure was suffocating her, but she couldn't bring herself to share her fears. Not when Tasha had been the one person who had supported her through every moment of this fight. Kama, I'm okay. Just waiting. I'm scared though. What if they don't do anything? A few seconds passed before Tasha replied. Tasha, you've already won, Kama. Don't let them take that away from you. You spoke your truth, and that's enough. No matter what happens next, you've made a difference. Kama felt a flicker of warmth spread through her chest. Her friend was right. This wasn't just about the outcome. It was about the fight itself. It was about reclaiming her voice, standing tall in the face of injustice. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Kama, we need to talk," her father's voice called from the other side. She opened the door to find him standing there, holding a piece of paper. His face was unreadable, but Kama could see the tension in his shoulders. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "They made their decision," her father said quietly, handing her the paper. "They've decided to suspend Mr. Parker for 2 weeks with mandatory diversity training. He'll also have to issue a formal apology to you, but they haven't mentioned anything about further disciplinary action." Kama's heart sank. 2 weeks. That was it? It felt like nothing. It felt like they were brushing it under the rug, as if Mr. Parker's actions were just a minor mistake that could be easily swept away. "That's it," she whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. "A 2-week suspension?" Her father nodded, his expression tight. "They're claiming it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't feel like enough, does it?" "No," Kama replied, her voice shaking with a mixture of frustration and anger. "It's not enough. He humiliated me, and they're treating it like it's a slap on the wrist. They're sending the message that it's okay to do this, as long as you apologize and go through some training." Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know, baby. I know. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. You've already made them listen. Now we push for more." Kama's eyes flashed with determination. Her father was right. This wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. She had stood up for herself, but now she had to keep pushing. For herself. For every other kid who had ever been treated like she had. She folded the letter and shoved it into her pocket, her jaw set with resolve. "We're not done here," she said firmly. "Not by a long shot. Kama's fight isn't over yet. What will she do next to ensure real justice is served?" Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama takes her stand even further, refusing to let this injustice be forgotten. When the system fails, sometimes you have to make noise loud enough for everyone to hear. The following week was a blur of meetings, phone calls, and protests. Kama's decision to not let Mr. Parker's punishment slide had set off a chain reaction she couldn't have anticipated. Word of the board's weak decision spread like wildfire through the community. At first, it was just whispers. Teachers, students, even parents questioning how a 2-week suspension could be enough for someone who had humiliated a child. But then, the whispers grew louder, turning into full-fledged outrage. Kama could feel it everywhere she went. In the hallways at school, on her way to classes, even in the grocery store with her father. People were talking, and it wasn't just the kids in her class or her friends from the protest. Teachers, alumni, and parents who had stayed silent for years were finally starting to speak up, and all of them, in their own way, were pushing for more. Her father had said it from the start. This wasn't just about her. It was about changing the system. It was about taking a stand for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. Kama hadn't realized how much weight that responsibility would carry. "Kama," Tasha said one afternoon after school, "I think it's time we do something bigger. We need to take this to the media." Kama paused, looking at her friend, unsure of what she meant. Tasha was always the planner, the one who came up with the bold ideas, but this felt like another level. "What do you mean, take it to the media?" Kama asked. "You want me to go on TV or something?" "I think we should," Tasha said. "You've been speaking out at school, and it's working, but it's not enough. People need to know what's really going on. You can't let them treat this like it's just some small mistake. They need to see how serious this is, how much it hurts." Kama felt her heart beat faster. It wasn't a bad idea, but it was terrifying. Going public meant exposing herself in a way she hadn't even considered before. The whole world would be watching. She would be judged, not just by the people who already knew her, but by complete strangers. Was she ready for that kind of spotlight? But as she thought about it, something shifted inside her. She remembered what it felt like to be humiliated, to be silenced. And if standing up for herself meant putting her story out there, then maybe it was worth it. "I'll do it," Kama said, her voice steady. "Let's call the local news." The next day, Kama sat in front of the camera, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy cloak. She could feel her nerves trembling beneath the surface, but her voice was clear and unwavering. The reporter's questions came fast, one after the other, and Kama answered them with the same honesty she had always shown. She talked about what had happened with Mr. Parker, how the school had failed to take meaningful action, and how she had fought to be heard. The reporter nodded, his face softening with empathy, but there was an edge to his words when he asked the question she had been dreading. Kama, do you think the school's decision was enough to address the harm that Mr. Parker caused? Kama took a deep breath. This was the moment. Her chance to make sure everyone knew that what had happened to her wasn't just a one-time incident. This wasn't about a single teacher. This was about an entire system that allowed people like Mr. Parker to go unchecked. No, Kama said, her voice firm. It's not enough. It's never going to be enough until they start listening to the voices of students like me. Until they make real changes. A 2-week suspension isn't justice. It's a slap in the face. The words hung in the air, powerful and unyielding. For a moment, there was silence in the room. As the news aired later that night, Kama couldn't help but feel a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Hope. The response was overwhelming. Calls and messages flooded in from across the community, some offering support, others expressing anger at the school's weak response. But the most significant were the stories from other students who had experienced similar discrimination, students who felt empowered to speak up because Kama had led the way. They were no longer silent. Her story was spreading, and it was no longer just about her. It was about every student who had ever felt invisible, every child who had ever been humiliated and left to suffer in silence. And she wasn't stopping now. Will Kama's story inspire real change, or will the system try to silence her once again? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces the backlash of her bold stand and prepares for an even greater battle. They don't silence people like me. They just make us louder. Kama's story had exploded across the local news, and with it came a wave of support and equally fierce opposition. The morning after her interview aired, she walked into school with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. The whispers were louder than usual, but it wasn't just the students. Teachers, too, gave her sidelong glances, as if trying to figure out what kind of student would make waves like she had. It was like she had triggered a storm, and now everyone was waiting for it to hit. But there was something else, something more sinister. The atmosphere had changed. Students who had once avoided her now avoided eye contact entirely, as if her fight for justice had made them uncomfortable. The line between allies and adversaries had become painfully clear. As she made her way to her first class, she saw Mr. Parker's name posted on the door of the faculty lounge. His absence was noticeable, but not unexpected. He'd been on a 2-week suspension, but Kama didn't believe for a second that he would stay away for long. People like him never did. They came back with a vengeance. She couldn't focus on that now. She had other things to deal with, things that were much more immediate. By lunch, the phone calls had started. Kama, we need to talk. Her father's voice crackled through the receiver. You've got a meeting with the school board. They're setting up a special session. Kama's heart skipped a beat. The school board had called a special meeting? She had been prepared for some kind of follow-up, but this felt different, serious. Something was happening, and it wasn't going to be easy. They want to discuss your comments on the news and how the community is reacting to your interview, her father explained. I'm coming with you. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us. Kama felt a surge of nerves, but it was quickly replaced with determination. She wasn't going to back down now, not after everything that had happened. If they thought they could intimidate her with a board meeting, they were sorely mistaken. The school board meeting that afternoon felt like an entirely different world. The room was filled with tight-lipped administrators, board members in suits, and even a few parents. There was no sign of Mr. Parker, but his presence loomed over the proceedings. It was clear that the tension in the room was all about him. Kama and her father walked in, heads held high. Her heart was pounding, but she wasn't going to let anyone see it. She wasn't here to be afraid. The chair of the board, a woman in her late 50s, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. She looked directly at Kama, her expression cold but calculated. Kama, she began, we're aware of the comments you made during your interview. While we respect your right to speak, we want to ensure that we handle this situation with proper decorum. The incident with Mr. Parker is unfortunate, but we believe his punishment was sufficient. Kama could feel her pulse quicken. Was this it? Were they really going to let him off with a slap on the wrist? That's not enough, Kama said, her voice unwavering. Mr. Parker didn't just make a mistake. He hurt me, and he hurt a lot of other students, too. This isn't just about one teacher. It's about the system that lets people like him get away with it. The room grew tense. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances. But the chairwoman wasn't having it. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping on the table. Kama, we understand that you're upset, but your interview has sparked more than just conversation. It's created division. Some people in this community feel that you've gone too far. You're stirring up trouble where there is none. Her words stung, but Kama held her ground. She could feel her father's reassuring presence beside her, silently urging her to speak her truth. If you think speaking up is stirring up trouble, Kama said, her voice growing louder, then you've been part of the problem all along. There was a stunned silence in the room. The board members exchanged nervous glances. The chairwoman opened her mouth to respond, but Kama's father spoke before she could. Enough, he said, his voice calm but commanding. My daughter is not here to be silenced. She's here to make sure that no other student has to suffer what she did. If you want to end this today, you need to take action. Real action, not just some empty gesture. Or we'll make sure this doesn't stop here. Kama looked at her father, feeling a surge of pride. This was the man who had always fought for what was right, and now she was standing beside him, ready to do the same. The meeting ended in a stalemate. The board wasn't ready to make any concessions, but they couldn't ignore the growing pressure from the community. Kama knew they weren't finished yet, but she had learned something important today. She couldn't expect others to fight for her. If she wanted justice, she would have to keep pushing. As she and her father left the meeting, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had started. She had raised her voice and now, the world was listening. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Will Kama's fight inspire the change she wants, or will the school board find a way to shut her down for good? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces her biggest challenge yet, facing the consequences of her actions. Sometimes you have to be the one to step into the storm, just to show everyone else they can too. The phone rang early the next morning, its shrill tones slicing through the silence of Kama's bedroom. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was her dad. Kama, we need to talk. Now. Her heart skipped a beat. There was an urgency in his voice that made her stomach tighten. She quickly threw off the covers and got dressed, her mind racing with possibilities. What was going on? By the time she arrived at her father's office, he was already sitting at his desk, his face drawn and serious. He looked up when she entered and gestured for her to sit. Kama, I need to be honest with you, he began, his voice low. The school board isn't backing down. In fact, they're escalating things. Kama's chest tightened. She already knew things were tense, but hearing it from her dad made it feel so much more real. She braced herself for the news she didn't want to hear. They're going to press charges for defamation, he continued, eyes fixed on her. They claim that your interview was full of lies about Mr. Parker and that you've caused irreparable damage to the school's reputation. Her heart dropped. Defamation? How could they do that when everything she said was true? Kama clenched her fists, trying to steady her breathing. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everything she had fought for, everything she had been trying to change. That's ridiculous, she muttered, her voice thick with frustration. They can't just make up charges like that. Her dad's face was a mix of anger and caution. I know, but we have to prepare for the fight. They're using everything they have to discredit you. And the worst part? They've got the media on their side. Kama sank into the chair, her mind spinning. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but this was worse than she had imagined. What do we do? She asked, her voice shaking with the weight of everything she had to face. Her father leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and calm. We fight back. We find every truth we can. Every student who has been mistreated, every teacher who has turned a blind eye. We get allies on our side, and we expose them for what they are. Kama swallowed hard, trying to steady her emotions. This wasn't just a battle for her reputation anymore. This was a fight for justice, for the truth. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. Kama and her dad worked tirelessly, reaching out to former students, organizing meetings with community leaders, and gathering every piece of evidence they could find. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but there was no turning back now. In the meantime, the backlash at school had only grown worse. Every corner she turned, there was a whispered comment, a disapproving glance, or worse, open hostility. She had never felt so alone. That Friday, the situation reached a boiling point. Kama was walking to her locker when she was approached by one of her classmates, Tyler. He had always been quiet but kind, someone she could count on. But today, his face was hard, his eyes cold. "I don't know what you think you're doing, Kama," he said, his voice low. "But you've made this whole school a target. People are talking about you like you're some kind of troublemaker. Maybe you should have just kept quiet." Kama was taken aback. "Tyler? Of all people? I'm not making trouble. I'm just telling the truth," she replied, her voice steady but her heart sinking. "If that makes me a troublemaker, then fine. But I'm not backing down." Tyler's face softened for a second, but then he stepped back, almost like he was afraid to stand with her. "You don't get it. You're making things worse. People are angry. You should have just let it go." Kama shook her head, frustration rising in her chest. "You're not the one who had your dignity torn apart. You're not the one who was humiliated in front of everyone. I can't just let it go." Tyler didn't say anything more. He just turned and walked away, leaving Kama standing there, feeling more isolated than ever. The weight of the situation was beginning to wear on her, but she wasn't about to let a few people, especially those who didn't understand, derail everything she had worked for. Later that day, Kama met her father at their local diner. She had spent hours going over the evidence they had gathered, trying to prepare for the fight that was ahead. But she still wasn't sure if they were strong enough to win. Her father looked at her across the table, his face filled with determination. "We've done everything we can. Now it's time to let the truth speak for itself." Kama nodded, swallowing down the lump in her throat. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to stop fighting for what was right. The storm was coming, and Kama was ready to face it head-on. What will Kama's next move be? Will she find enough support to expose the truth, or will the pressure prove too much to handle? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces the ultimate test, taking her fight all the way to court. The truth doesn't care about your feelings, but it will always set you free. Kama sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the pile of legal documents before her. They were filled with words that seemed foreign, overwhelming, and heavy. The court case was real now, and it was happening faster than she could process. Her father had worked tirelessly, contacting legal experts and preparing for the inevitable. They were ready to fight. Every word, every piece of evidence was part of their strategy to expose the truth about Mr. Parker's actions. But the fear gnawed at her, the uncertainty of what might happen if they lost. Could she handle the fallout? Was she prepared for the world to turn against her? The sound of her father's footsteps outside her door snapped her out of her thoughts. He entered without knocking, a familiar sign that he wasn't here for pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight with the seriousness of the situation. Kama's heart skipped. She knew the look in his eyes. This was no time for hesitation. "About what?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "I've received word that the school board is going to try and make a public statement tomorrow," he said, sitting down across from her. "They're going to try and discredit everything we've gathered, twist the narrative, and make it seem like we're just trying to ruin someone's life." Kama clenched her fists. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything she had worked for, everything that had led her to this moment. The truth was on her side, but she knew the other side would stop at nothing to protect their own. "They'll stop at nothing to win," Kama murmured. "But we can't let them silence us. We can't let them win." Her father nodded. "That's why we need to be prepared. Tomorrow is going to be a pivotal moment. We have to take control of the narrative before they do." The next morning, the air felt thick with anticipation. Kama could hardly breathe, but she forced herself to move through the motions. She had a meeting with the school board scheduled, and the pressure was almost unbearable. Her father was by her side as they entered the room. It was large, sterile. Everything about it felt like it was designed to intimidate. A long table stretched across the center, with several members of the school board seated behind it. They looked serious, unsympathetic. And across from them, Mr. Parker sat, wearing an expression that was too calm for someone whose career was on the line. Kama's heart pounded as her father stood at her side, ready to speak. They had spent hours discussing their strategy, making sure they were ready for every possible turn the conversation could take. It wasn't just about presenting evidence anymore. It was about standing tall, facing them with unwavering confidence. The board president cleared his throat, cutting through the silence. We're here today to address the allegations made by Ms. Kama Williams regarding Mr. Parker's actions. This is a serious matter, and we expect this meeting to be handled professionally. Kama didn't flinch. She had no intention of backing down. I'm here to speak the truth, she said, her voice strong. The truth that I was humiliated, treated unfairly, and discriminated against. Mr. Parker's actions were not only unjust, they were cruel. And I won't sit here and pretend like they didn't happen. The room was silent for a long moment, the tension thick. Then, the board president spoke again, but this time, there was a hint of frustration in his tone. We have evidence suggesting that you've been misrepresenting the events, that your claims are exaggerated. Mr. Parker has been a respected teacher for years, and we intend to protect his reputation. If you continue down this path, we will pursue legal action for defamation. Kama felt her father's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. We're not afraid of your threats, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. We have witnesses, we have records, and we have the truth. You're not going to silence my daughter. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly rattled by her father's words. But they quickly regained their composure. We'll see about that, one of them said coldly. The matter is under investigation, but be warned, Ms. Williams. The truth may not be what you think it is. Kama's mind raced. They could say whatever they wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. She was not going to back down. Not now, not ever. As the meeting ended, Kama felt a mixture of relief and dread. She had faced the board, held her ground, and told her side of the story. But the fight was far from over. Her father turned to her, his eyes proud but filled with concern. You did well, but this is just the beginning. They're going to push back harder now. Kama nodded, her jaw clenched. Let them. I'm not backing down. Her father smiled, though it was tinged with the weight of what lay ahead. I know, and I'm right here with you every step of the way. Later that day, as Kama walked back to her car, she couldn't help but think about everything that had led her to this point. She had fought through so much already. Her father's support, the ridicule from classmates, the pressure from the school board. But none of it had broken her, and it never would. The battle had only just begun. What will be Kama's next move? Will she uncover the truth before it's too late? Or will the school board's tactics succeed in silencing her once and for all? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces a choice that could change everything. Will she stay the course or walk away? You can't change the truth, no matter how hard you try to bury it. Kama didn't sleep that night. Her mind replayed every word from the meeting, every look exchanged between the school board members, and every threat from Mr. Parker's supporters. She couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, a conspiracy designed to crush her before she could fully speak her truth. By morning, the weight of everything had settled in, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. She couldn't afford to lose her nerve now, not after everything she had been through. Her dad's words echoed in her mind. The truth is on your side, and it's the only thing that matters. But the next move had to be calculated. The school board wasn't going to give up without a fight, and neither was Mr. Parker. Kama knew she had to be one step ahead. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for every student who had ever been silenced, every person who had been made to feel inferior because of the color of their skin. Her phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her father. Kama, I need you to meet me at the office, he said urgently. We've got new information. Something that could change everything. The office was bustling as usual when Kama walked in, but her father's tense expression was enough to make her heart skip a beat. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He motioned for her to sit. "We've got an anonymous tip. Someone from within the school system has been feeding us information about Mr. Parker's past. Turns out, he's got a history of complaints that go way back, complaints that have never been properly investigated." Kama's pulse quickened. What kind of complaints? Her father pulled out a stack of documents, each one more damning than the last. "It seems Mr. Parker has a pattern, targeting students of color, making discriminatory remarks, even accusations of inappropriate behavior that were brushed under the rug. The board knew, they knew, and they protected him." Kama couldn't breathe. Everything she had suspected was true. The system had failed her, and it had failed so many others. This wasn't just about one teacher's actions. It was about a systemic issue that needed to be exposed. If the board had been complicit in hiding his past, it meant they had also failed the students they were supposed to protect. Her father looked at her with a steady gaze. "This could be our game changer, We need to go public with this." By the time Kama and her father walked into the press conference room, she could feel the weight of every eye on them. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and reporters jostled for a chance to speak. "This is it," her father whispered, his hand on her back. "You're ready." Kama took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the voice of every student who had ever been silenced. This was her moment to make sure the truth was heard. Her father gave her a reassuring smile before stepping back, allowing her to take the stage alone. The room quieted as she stepped up to the podium, her hands gripping the edges of it for support. She looked out at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, some skeptical, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth. She cleared her throat, gathering her strength. "I'm Kama Williams, and I'm here to tell you about the truth that the school board has been trying to hide. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. Mr. Parker's actions were part of a pattern, one that goes back years, affecting students like me, students of color, who were never given a voice." The room shifted. Whispers spread like wildfire. The reporters were on the edge of their seats. Kama continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I've seen the documents, heard the stories of students who were silenced, who were afraid to speak out because they knew the system would protect the wrong people. I will not allow that to happen anymore. I will not allow my voice to be silenced." The room was dead silent, the air thick with anticipation. Kama could feel the weight of their gazes, but she didn't falter. She had come too far to turn back now. "And I'm not alone," she added, her voice growing more resolute. "I'm standing here today because there are others who have suffered in silence, but no more. It's time for the truth to come to light." The fallout was immediate and brutal. The school board issued a statement denying the allegations, but it was clear they were scrambling. Mr. Parker's lawyer tried to discredit Kama's claims, calling them nothing more than a personal vendetta. But the more they fought back, the more their lies unraveled. The community rallied around Kama. Other students came forward with their own stories, their voices amplified by the media attention. What had started as one girl's fight for justice was now a movement, a wave of truth that could no longer be stopped. Later that evening, as Kama sat at her kitchen table, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an anonymous source, someone inside the school board. "I know everything. I'll help you take them down. Meet me tomorrow. You'll need this." Attached to the message was a photo of Mr. Parker standing with a school board member, both of them smiling, unaware they were being watched. But it wasn't the photo that caught Kama's eye. It was the file name, proof of everything. The truth was finally coming to light, but it wasn't over yet. What will Kama do with the new evidence? Will she be able to expose the full extent of the school board's corruption? Or will the powerful forces that protect Mr. Parker succeed in stopping her? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama uncovers the last piece of the puzzle, one that could change everything. Once the mask comes off, there's no going back. But it's better to face the truth than live a lie. The next morning, Kama met with her father at the office, her hands shaking as she held the phone with the damning photo. The message was clear. Someone from within the system was on her side, and they were offering the final piece to expose everything. "We need to be careful," her father said, studying the file. "This could be bigger than you think. If the board's been covering for Parker all these years, we're about to take down a lot of people." Kama nodded, her eyes locked on the file in her father's hands. Proof of everything, that was the name of the file. It had to be the missing link, the one thing that would expose the entire conspiracy. "We're close, Dad," Kama said, trying to steady her breath. "We just need to move fast. If we give them time, they'll cover it up again, just like they did before." Her father glanced at the photo once more. It was taken at a fundraising event several years ago. Mr. Parker, standing next to one of the school board members, both of them smiling, unaware that their every move was being tracked. The photo was incriminating enough, but the file inside was the real weapon. "This could tie the board members to more than just Parker's actions," her father said, his voice growing more serious. "If we go public with this, we're not just fighting for you anymore. We're fighting for everyone who's been hurt by this system." Kama's stomach churned. The weight of it was overwhelming, but she knew they were right. The truth had to come out. "Let's do it," she said. "But we need to make sure the public can see the full picture. We can't just hand over the evidence. We need to tell the story in a way that forces them to listen." By the time the press conference was scheduled, Kama's nerves were at a breaking point. She couldn't escape the feeling that the board was already making their next move to stop her, and that meant she had to be even more prepared. Her father, ever the strategist, had made sure every detail was in place. The press conference would be live-streamed, with reporters from every outlet ready to hear Kama's side of the story. But it wasn't just her story she was telling. It was the story of every student who had been silenced, every victim of abuse who had been ignored, and every injustice that had been swept under the rug. The room was packed. Reporters, cameras, and concerned citizens crowded around, waiting for Kama to speak. She could feel the tension building in the air, the electricity of the moment pulsing through her veins. She was about to change everything. Her father stood beside her, calm but vigilant, while Kama adjusted the microphone in front of her. She had come so far, but there was no turning back now. She took a deep breath and began. "I'm Kama Williams, and I've been telling you the truth all along," she started, her voice steady but filled with the weight of her words. "But the truth is much bigger than just what happened to me. It's about a system that has protected people like Mr. Parker for far too long. People who abuse their power, knowing they'll never face consequences because the system is built to protect them." She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, every eye on her. She could feel the reporters' anticipation, their hunger for more. "I've gathered evidence that proves the school board knew about Mr. Parker's behavior, that they enabled it, and that they've been protecting him for years," she continued. "This photo," she held it up for everyone to see, was taken at a fundraiser where Mr. Parker and one of the board members were publicly affiliated. This may seem like just another photo, but it's the key to a bigger story. A story of corruption that reaches deeper than I ever imagined. She could hear the murmurs spread through the crowd, reporters scribbling frantically in their notebooks. "But that's not all," Kama said, her voice growing stronger. "There's a file, an entire archive of complaints, investigations, and cover-ups that were conveniently ignored. People have tried to silence the truth for too long, but now, the truth is coming to light." Her hand trembled slightly as she held up the file. The weight of it felt immense, like the weight of every person who had been wronged and every moment they had lost. She wasn't just exposing one man's crimes. She was exposing an entire system that had failed them all. "I'm not alone," Kama added, her eyes scanning the room. "I'm here for every student who couldn't speak up, for every parent who's been dismissed, for every teacher who was afraid to lose their job for doing what's right. This isn't just my fight, it's everyone's fight. And it's time we take it to the highest level." The fallout was immediate and furious. The school board's response was swift, denying every accusation, discrediting Kama as a disgruntled student with a personal vendetta. But the more they pushed back, the more the public turned against them. The evidence Kama presented was irrefutable, and the more people saw the corruption at the heart of the board, the harder it was for anyone to defend them. The media exploded with coverage. People took to social media, organizing protests, demanding that the board members step down. Kama's name spread like wildfire. She was no longer just a victim. She was a hero. She was the spark that lit a fire of change. But not everyone was on her side. Powerful people in the community began to close ranks, trying to intimidate Kama and her family. Threats came in every form. Anonymous calls, veiled warnings, even attempts to smear her reputation. But Kama didn't flinch. She was past fear. She was past doubt. She knew what she had to do. Later that night, as she sat alone in her room, her phone buzzed again. It was a text message from the anonymous source who had given her the evidence. "You're not alone, Kama. The truth is on your side. But they won't go down without a fight. Be ready for whatever comes next." The battle was just beginning. Will Kama be able to withstand the backlash from the school board's allies? Will the public's support be enough to bring about real change? Find out in the next chapter, where Kama faces her biggest challenge yet and uncovers even more hidden secrets that could turn the tide in her fight for justice. In a war, there are no small victories. Every win costs something, and every loss makes you stronger. Kama couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast. The press conference had been a success, far more than she had imagined. But the response from the school board had been swift, organized, and ruthless. They weren't just trying to deny the accusations, they were trying to bury her. She sat at the kitchen table that evening, going over the responses from the board members and their allies. The messages were clear. "We will destroy you if we have to." They had dismissed her accusations, calling them unsubstantiated. But the shadow of their influence loomed large. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. The weight of their power was heavy, but Kama knew she couldn't back down now. Her father had been right all along. The fight was bigger than her. This was about more than just her own revenge. It was about exposing a system that had been manipulating and exploiting students for far too long. The phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from the same anonymous source who had helped her earlier. She opened it with shaking hands. "They're watching you. Be careful. The next move will be theirs." Kama froze. Her heart raced as she reread the message. She had suspected it, but now it was real. There were people out there who wanted to stop her. People who were powerful enough to make sure her fight never saw the light of day. Her father walked into the kitchen, his expression grim. He had just returned from a meeting with his lawyer, trying to navigate the legal minefield that was sure to come. It wasn't just about the school board anymore. It was about ensuring Kama's safety. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing the look on her face. Kama handed him the phone, her voice low. "They know. Someone's watching us." Her father's eyes darkened as he read the message. He was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "They're not going to make this easy, Kama. You're up against some of the most powerful people in this city. If we're not careful, they'll find a way to ruin you before you can finish what you started." She clenched her fists, her anger rising. "I'm not going to let them stop me. I'm not afraid of them." "I know you're not," her father said, his voice soft but firm. "But we need to be strategic. You've exposed the truth, but now we need to make sure it sticks. We need to get ahead of their next move before they can turn the public against us." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and planning. Kama felt like she was living in a constant state of alert, always waiting for the next threat to strike. But she couldn't let fear control her. She was so close. Kama spent hours reviewing the file, the one that had started it all. The board members' connections, the bribery, the cover-ups, everything was there. But there was still something missing. One more piece of evidence that would tie it all together and make sure no one could deny the truth. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text. It was a voicemail. She hesitated for a moment before playing it. "Kama." The voice on the other end was familiar. It was from her old friend Andrea. "I don't know if this will help, but I think I found something. I need you to meet me, but we have to be careful. They're watching." Kama's heart skipped a beat. Andrea had been her close friend in school, someone she trusted implicitly. But they had lost touch after high school, and she hadn't heard from her in years. What had she found? And why was it so urgent? She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and headed out the door. The meeting place was an old cafe on the edge of town, a spot that Andrea had always liked. It was quiet, almost forgotten by the rest of the world. But it was perfect for a conversation that needed to remain secret. Kama arrived first, scanning the area nervously. She sat at a corner table and waited. Every car that passed made her tense. Every shadow made her suspicious. It felt like she was being watched, like the walls were closing in. Minutes later, Andrea appeared, slipping into the seat across from her. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "I don't have much time," Andrea whispered, "but I think I found something in Parker's old emails. It's not just him. There's a whole group of them, a network. They've been covering their tracks for years, but I've got one email that could blow it all open." Kama leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What does it say?" Andrea handed her a piece of paper, a printout of the email. It was from Parker to one of the board members, but what made it so damning wasn't just the content, it was the date. The email was from a year ago, after Kama had already started to make her accusations public. "The situation with Kama has escalated. We need to act fast. It's time to discredit her before this becomes a bigger problem. Do whatever it takes, but make sure it's quiet. No one can know we're involved." Kama's stomach churned as she read the message. This wasn't just about Mr. Parker's actions anymore. It was about a larger conspiracy, one that involved the people who were supposed to protect her. "This is it," Kama said, voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. "This is the evidence we need to take them down for good." Andrea nodded, but there was a shadow in her eyes. "Just be careful, Kama. They won't let you expose this without a fight." The battle had entered its most dangerous phase, and Kama knew there was no turning back now. She had the truth on her side, but truth alone wouldn't be enough to win this war. What will Kama do with the explosive new evidence? Can she trust Andrea? Or is there more to this than meets the eye? Don't miss the next chapter, where Kama makes her boldest move yet, and the danger reaches new heights. They're not just going to let you walk away from this. You're in this for the long haul now. Kama's hand trembled as she held the printout from Andrea. The weight of the email felt heavier with every passing second. This was it, the piece of evidence that could take everything down. But with it came the realization that this fight was bigger than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just fighting Mr. Parker anymore. She wasn't even just fighting the school board. She was fighting a network of powerful people who would stop at nothing to silence her. She couldn't do this alone. The problem was, she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. "Meet me at the office. We need to talk strategy." She didn't hesitate. Kama stood up, stuffing the printout into her bag, and hurried to the door. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her face, sharp and biting. It made her feel more alive than ever. The weight of what she was about to do pressed on her, but there was no turning back now. When she arrived at her father's office, the tension in the air was palpable. He was pacing behind his desk, his jaw clenched tight. "You got the email, didn't you?" he asked without looking up. Kama nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I have the evidence. It's all there, Dad. Parker and the board members, everything." Her father stopped pacing and turned to face her. There was a flicker of relief in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a hard, determined look. "We need to get this into the right hands. The public needs to see it. This is our moment, Kama. If we can expose them now, we can end this." Kama felt a surge of adrenaline at his words. She had spent so long feeling like a lone warrior, but now, for the first time, she felt like she had a true ally. Her father was more than just her protector. He was a fighter, just like her. And together, they could tear down the wall the school board had built around their lives. But the reality of what they were up against hit her hard. They couldn't just release this information into the public and hope for the best. If they did, they would have a target on their backs, and there was no telling what lengths the board members would go to in order to protect themselves. "We need to be smart about this," her father said, reading her thoughts. "If we go public too soon, they'll discredit us before we can make an impact. We need to make sure we have every angle covered." Kama knew he was right, but as much as she wanted to expose everything right now, she understood the stakes. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. The next few hours were a blur of planning, phone calls, and calculations. Kama and her father mapped out a strategy, weighing the risks of every move. It was a delicate balance, One wrong step could send them straight into the path of those who wanted to silence them. As the night wore on, Kama's thoughts began to drift. She thought about her mother, about how she would have fought for Kama, no matter the cost. Her mother had always taught her to stand tall, to speak up when something wasn't right, and to never back down. But was it enough? Could Kama stand up to this level of power? The question lingered in her mind as she looked over the evidence once more. The truth was right in front of her, but the battle wasn't over yet. The next day, Kama and her father made their move. They had managed to get a meeting with a trusted investigative journalist, someone who had a reputation for taking down corrupt systems. Kama felt a strange sense of calm as they walked into the reporter's office. She didn't know what was going to happen, but she knew it was the right thing to do. This was the moment when everything could change. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, didn't waste any time. She took the printout from Kama's bag, glanced at it, and then met her eyes. "This is big," Lisa said quietly, her tone grave. "But it's dangerous. You understand that, right?" Kama nodded. "I understand, but I'm not going to let them get away with this." Lisa studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I'll run with this, but you need to be prepared. Once this story breaks, there's no turning back. They're going to come after you." Kama's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm ready." The story broke the following morning. It hit the news like an explosion. Every headline seemed to scream Kama's name: high school scandal exposed, corruption at the top, whistleblower reveals cover-up involving school board members and teachers, and investigation launched into alleged misconduct at local school. It felt surreal. Kama watched as her phone buzzed nonstop, messages flooding in from friends, family, and strangers. Some were supportive, others were angry, but all of them were shocked by the revelation. But the victory was short-lived. As quickly as the story spread, the backlash began. The school board released a statement condemning Kama's accusations, calling her a disgruntled student with an agenda. They claimed the evidence was fabricated, and they demanded an immediate retraction. It wasn't just words. Kama began receiving threatening messages, some anonymous, some from people she knew. They were warning her to back off, to stop digging. She wasn't just up against the school board anymore. She was up against a machine designed to protect the powerful and silence the truth. Kama sat alone in her room, staring at the messages. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't going to back down. She had come too far. Now, it was a matter of survival. What will Kama do next? Will she stay strong in the face of increasing danger, or will the pressure break her? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces the toughest choice of her life. They won't stop, but neither will I. Kama didn't sleep that night. The adrenaline from the bombshell story still coursed through her veins, and the messages, both threatening and supportive, kept her up. But it wasn't the words that kept her awake. It was the silence, the looming threat of what might come next. Her father had warned her that this would be just the beginning, and he was right. The next morning, as Kama scrolled through her phone, she saw that the media had already picked up on the story. It was everywhere: local news, social media, even national outlets. There was no going back. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She hardly recognized herself anymore. The girl who had once been so unsure of her place in the world was now at the center of a scandal, the target of a campaign to discredit her. Her resolve was hardening, but the weight of what she had started, what she had unleashed, was settling in her bones. A knock at the door broke her trance. It was her father, his face grim. "You need to come with me. We're taking this to the next level," he said, his voice low but firm. Kama grabbed her bag and followed him out of the house. They didn't speak during the drive, the tension between them thickening with each passing mile. Her father was always a man of few words, but today, there was something different in his eyes. He was worried. When they arrived at a small, nondescript building in the downtown area, Kama felt her stomach tighten. The place had an unmarked door and a single window with dark blinds. Her father led her inside, where they were greeted by a tall, quiet man in a black suit. "This is Jack," her father introduced him. "He's our security expert. We're going to need protection from here on out." Kama barely had time to register Jack's presence before he handed her a phone. already activated and locked with a passcode. Change your number, Jack said, his voice steady. And keep this on you at all times. We're going to need to be careful. As Kama pocketed the phone, she felt the gravity of the situation sinking deeper. It wasn't just the school board anymore. They had become a target. People with power, people who didn't want to lose their control, would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Her father led her into a back room, where a large computer screen was displaying a map of the city. We've already traced some of the threats, her father said. This isn't just about the school board. There's a network of people who don't want this getting out. We're going to need to stay 2 steps ahead of them. Kama's mind raced. The map on the screen showed pins marking places she'd never thought to look before. Her school, her father's office, even her home. These were places she should feel safe, but now they felt like traps. Her thoughts went back to Mr. Parker, the teacher who had humiliated her. But was he the mastermind, or just a pawn? And how deep did this go? I know this is a lot to take in, her father said, his voice softening, but we're doing the right thing. You've already done more than most people would ever dare. Kama nodded, though her thoughts were still spinning. She wanted to believe that, but the reality of the danger was far more real than she had ever imagined. By the time they returned home, the atmosphere had changed. Kama's phone was buzzing nonstop. Every notification, every email, every message was an overwhelming reminder of how far the storm had reached. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of digital chaos, each wave bringing more pressure, more threats, more chaos. As soon as they walked through the door, her phone rang. It was Lisa, the journalist. I just wanted to check in, Lisa said. How are you holding up? Kama let out a shaky breath. I'm not sure anymore. I thought I could handle this, but now... I know, Lisa interrupted, but you're stronger than you think. You're already making waves. The story's going viral, and it's only a matter of time before someone's held accountable. But at what cost? Kama asked, her voice cracking. This isn't just about a school anymore. This is about something bigger. And I don't know if I can handle what's coming next. Lisa was silent for a moment before answering. You can, Kama. You have to. And I'll be with you every step of the way. But be careful. People like this don't play by the rules. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their power. Kama's hand clenched around her phone. I'm not backing down. I know, Lisa said softly. Just remember, you're not alone. The following day, Kama sat in her bedroom, looking out at the street below. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. She had made her choice. She had gone public with the truth, and now she was in the crosshairs of the people who wanted to bury it. Her father entered the room, his face a mask of concern. We need to talk, he said quietly. Kama stood, her heart pounding. About what? They're coming after you, Kama. We've already gotten word that they're planning something. I don't know what it is yet, but you need to be prepared. Her pulse quickened. Prepared for what? Her father's eyes hardened. Whatever it takes to stop you. The game had changed. Now it was war. What lengths will Kama go to protect herself and expose the truth? Stay tuned for the next chapter, where Kama faces a dangerous decision that could change everything. Sometimes the truth doesn't come without a fight. Kama could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her as she sat in her room, alone with her thoughts. The phone calls had grown more frequent, more insistent. The threats were no longer veiled. She had been called everything from a liar to a troublemaker, and worse. But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, something shifted within her. She wasn't scared anymore. She was angry. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. They were coming for her, and it wouldn't be long before they made their move. The feeling of being hunted was something Kama had never imagined, and yet here she was, at the center of a storm she had inadvertently started. But there was no turning back now. She had made her decision. She needed to finish what she had started. The next morning, Kama woke up early. The house was quiet, her father still asleep after a long night of monitoring their security measures. She had spent hours researching every detail she could about Mr. Parker and the people who had tried to silence her. But the deeper she dug, the more she uncovered. This wasn't just about a racist teacher. This was about a system that was rotting from the inside. A system that used people like Kama as scapegoats to maintain its power. She grabbed her phone and texted Lisa. "We need to meet. There's something bigger going on." Lisa responded almost immediately. "I knew it. I'll meet you at the cafe in an hour." As Kama made her way to the cafe, her mind raced. What had started as a fight for her dignity had transformed into something much larger than herself. This was no longer just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, pushed aside, and ignored. When she arrived, Lisa was already waiting at their usual table, her eyes scanning the room nervously. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Kama said, sitting down across from her. Lisa shook her head. "I'm just trying to wrap my head around everything." "You're sure about this? That you want to go public with what you've found?" Kama met her gaze. "There's no other option. People need to know what's really going on. The truth can't stay buried any longer." Lisa hesitated. "But you know this is going to get worse before it gets better, right?" Kama nodded. "I know, but I can't live with myself if I don't do something about it." Lisa leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "There are people higher up than Mr. Parker, Kama. People who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets. You're playing a dangerous game." Kama felt a chill run through her. "I'm already in the game, Lisa. It's too late to back out now." Just then, Kama's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Kama." The voice on the other end was cold, unfamiliar. "I hope you're ready for what's coming." Kama's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you stop. Now, you have no idea what you're dealing with. You don't want to go down this road." Kama's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not afraid of you." There was a pause, then the voice on the other end laughed. "You should be." The call ended abruptly. Kama put her phone down, her breath shallow. Lisa watched her closely, her expression shifting from concern to resolve. "You can't ignore that, Kama. This is just the beginning." Kama took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I don't have a choice anymore. This is bigger than just me, and I'm going to make sure the world knows the truth." Lisa gave her a firm nod. "Then let's make it count. Let's take them down." Back at home, Kama sat in front of her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had gathered enough evidence to expose Mr. Parker's involvement in the system of corruption. But there was one thing she needed to confirm. One final piece of the puzzle that would tie everything together. The clock was ticking, and she knew that with every passing moment, the threat to her safety was growing stronger. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She stood, cautiously approaching the door. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a suit standing on the other side. She didn't recognize him. Her heart raced as she quickly moved to her father's office to grab the emergency phone. She returned to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her. Not now. Not ever. She opened the door. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Kama, right?" "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. "I think we should talk," the man said. "You've got a lot of people worried." Kama's mind raced. "About what?" "About the truth you're trying to expose," he said. "You're making a big mistake, Kama. A very big mistake." Will Kama be able to stand her ground as the storm closes in around her? Find out what happens next in Chapter 16, as the stakes get higher and the dangers closer than ever. The truth isn't free. It demands a sacrifice. Kama stood in the doorway, facing the man in the suit, her mind racing. He wasn't here to talk. She could feel it. The way his eyes darted around the room, the controlled calm in his voice. It wasn't the demeanor of someone seeking conversation. It was the kind of look someone wore when they knew you were about to make a mistake that could cost you everything. "I don't think you understand," the man continued, stepping closer as if he knew the power his presence held. "You're dealing with forces much larger than your little rebellion here. You can't just walk into the lion's den and expect to come out unscathed. People like you get lost, Kama. People like you disappear." She felt a surge of defiance flood her chest, pushing back the growing dread. "What's your name? Who sent you?" The man smiled, a tight, calculated grin. "You don't need to know that. What matters is the message I'm delivering. The truth isn't going to make you a hero, Kama. It's going to ruin you. Kama's mind was spinning. She had already gone too far to turn back, but something about the way the man spoke sent a chill through her bones. She glanced over her shoulder, where her father's office door was slightly ajar, and she felt a pang of guilt. She couldn't let him get involved in this. He had already done so much for her, and now she was dragging him into her war. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of any of them. I'm not afraid of your threats, Kama said, standing tall. I know what's at stake, and I'm ready to face it. The man's face darkened, and for a moment, she saw something cold, dangerous, in his eyes. Then, he took a step back, his tone shifting as he lowered his voice. You'll regret this. Mark my words, Kama. You'll regret every moment of it. People like you don't win. She clenched her fists, refusing to let him see the doubt creeping into her mind. You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, as if sizing up whether she was truly worth the effort of destroying. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Kama standing at the door with her heart pounding in her chest. She waited until his footsteps faded, the weight of his words lingering in the air. It was one thing to face a teacher like Mr. Parker, but this man, this was different. He wasn't just a part of the system. He was its enforcer. Kama closed the door, locking it behind her. She walked over to her desk, her fingers trembling as she picked up her phone. There was no time to waste. She needed to keep moving. She texted Lisa again. Meet me at the office. I have everything we need. As she waited for the reply, she stared at the screen of her computer. The files, the pictures, the conversations, everything was ready to go. All it would take was one click, and the truth would be out there for everyone to see. But there was a nagging feeling in her gut that she couldn't shake. What if this wasn't enough? What if they came for her family next? What if? Her phone buzzed. Lisa's message read, I'll be there in 20 minutes. Kama stood up, pacing back and forth. The storm was coming, and she wasn't sure if she could weather it. But she had made a promise to herself, to her family, to everyone who had been silenced before her. She wasn't going to be another statistic. She wasn't going to be the one who cowered in the face of fear. She was going to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. Later that evening, Lisa arrived at the house, her face tense as she walked into Kama's room. The door was closed behind her, the air thick with anticipation. Are you sure you're ready for this? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kama nodded, her eyes locked on the screen in front of her. I don't have a choice anymore. If we don't do this now, we're just waiting for the inevitable. I'm not going to sit here and let them win. Lisa looked over at the screen, where Kama had pulled up the final documents, correspondence between Mr. Parker and several others in the administration, clearly covering up not only his actions but the network of individuals who had allowed it to continue for years. You're sure they won't be able to trace this back to you? Lisa asked, glancing at the security measures Kama had put in place. Kama smiled grimly. I've covered my tracks. No one will know it was me. Lisa hesitated. What about your dad? Is he okay with this? Kama exhaled slowly. He doesn't know, and he doesn't need to. I'm the one making this decision. There was a brief silence before Lisa spoke again. I still don't know how you're doing this. I'd be scared out of my mind. Kama let out a breath, her hands shaking as she hovered over the keyboard. I'm terrified, Lisa, but I'm not backing down. Not now. With a final glance at Lisa, Kama pressed send. The email containing all the evidence, the names, the proof, was on its way. And with that click, Kama knew that there was no going back. Would Kama's decision come with a price she wasn't prepared to pay? In the end, we are all judged by the choices we make. The email had been sent. There was no undoing it now. Kama sat at her desk, her fingers frozen over her keyboard as the weight of what she had just done settled over her like a thick, suffocating blanket. She glanced at Lisa, who was pacing back and forth across the room, her face drawn with worry. You really think they'll take us seriously? Lisa asked, the doubt in her voice barely hidden. I mean, what if they just cover it up again? You know how they work. They've been doing it for years. Kama didn't answer immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, running through every possible outcome. She knew the risk. But what was the alternative? To let them continue to hurt people? To let them win? She couldn't do that. I don't know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I had to try. If we don't, we're no better than they are. Lisa nodded, though her concern didn't fade. Just be careful. You've already put so much on the line. Don't let them get to you. The words hung in the air as Kama stared at the screen in front of her, her heart racing. She knew the storm was coming. She just didn't know how bad it would be. Hours passed. The silence of the room was suffocating as Kama tried to focus on anything but the dread slowly creeping into her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. Kama, a deep, unfamiliar voice said on the other end. You've made a big mistake. Her blood ran cold. It was the same voice she had heard earlier in the day, the man who had threatened her. You've been warned, he continued, his tone dark and threatening. You think you're doing the right thing, but you're only setting yourself up for failure. You've got no idea who you're dealing with. Kama's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. I don't care who you are. You don't scare me. The voice on the other end chuckled. You will. When it all comes crashing down, you'll wish you had never started this. The line went dead before Kama could respond. She stared at the phone in her hand, her mind racing. This was it. The warning had been clear. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. What's going on? Lisa asked, her voice filled with concern as she saw the look on Kama's face. Kama shook her head. That was him again. The guy who showed up earlier today. He's threatening me. I think they know what we're doing. Lisa's eyes widened. This is serious. We need to. Before she could finish, Kama's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was from her father. She opened the message, her heart sinking as she read it. Kama, where are you? They've called a meeting at the school. They want to speak to you and your father about the allegations you've made. They're demanding answers. I need to talk to you. Kama's mind raced. Her father was involved now. She couldn't let him get caught up in this. Not after everything he'd done for her. He didn't deserve this kind of pressure. We need to go, she said urgently, grabbing her bag and rushing toward the door. They're calling my dad in. We have to stop this before it gets worse. Lisa grabbed her coat and followed her. What are you going to do? You can't just go in there and pretend everything's fine. I'm not going to pretend anything, Kama said, determination hardening in her voice. I'm going to confront them. I'm going to make them listen. But first, I need you to make sure they can't silence us. We need backup. Lisa nodded without hesitation. I'm on it. You just focus on getting through this. The two women rushed out the door, their nerves on edge as they made their way to the school. Kama felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, each step heavy with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. She had taken the first step to expose the truth, but she wasn't ready for the battle that awaited her. She wasn't sure if she was even strong enough for it. As they reached the school, Kama's anxiety hit a new high. The parking lot was nearly empty, the lights dim and flickering in the cool evening air. She could see figures moving inside the building, and the tight knot in her chest grew even tighter. Stay close, she said to Lisa, her voice barely a whisper. If they come for us, we need to be ready. Lisa nodded, her eyes scanning the parking lot. They approached the building, and as they stepped inside, they were greeted by the cold, sterile walls of the school's administration offices. It felt like walking into the lion's den. A figure appeared in the hallway, and Kama's heart dropped. It was Mr. Parker, the man who had started it all. He was flanked by two other men, their faces shadowed, their postures rigid. So, you've decided to show up, Mr. Parker said, his voice laced with venom. You think you can just waltz in here and make demands? You think you can just ruin people's lives without facing any consequences? Kama took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. I'm not ruining anyone's life, she said, her voice steady. I'm trying to save them. Would Kama be able to confront the people who had terrorized her for so long? Find out in Chapter 18, as the confrontation escalates and Kama realizes just how deep the corruption goes. The truth is a powerful weapon, one that can shatter the most carefully built facades. The tension in the air was almost palpable as Kama and Lisa stood in the dimly lit hallway, facing the trio of men, each one a symbol of the authority and power that had ruled the school for years. Mr. Parker, with his smug, self-assured smile, stepped forward, flanked by the other two men. "You really don't understand what you've done, do you?" Mr. Parker's voice dripped with condescension. "You think you're some kind of hero, but all you're doing is digging a hole for yourself." Kama stood her ground, her hands trembling at her sides, but her resolve unshaken. "You don't get to threaten me anymore, Mr. Parker. I'm done being afraid." The two men behind him exchanged a look, one of them cracking his knuckles as if preparing for something much worse than words. Lisa shifted beside Kama, her posture tense. "We know what you did. It's not just about the hair. It never was." Mr. Parker's eyes flashed, a flicker of panic showing through his carefully constructed mask of indifference. "You really think people are going to believe you? A child like you against me? You're in way over your head." But Kama wasn't backing down. "I'm not just a child. And this isn't about just me anymore. It's about everyone you've hurt. Everyone who's been too scared to speak up." Her words cut through the air like a sharp blade, and for the first time, Mr. Parker's composure cracked. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could say another word, Kama's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out quickly, her eyes widening as she read the text message that flashed on the screen. "The school board is on their way. Get ready." Her heart skipped a beat. The school board. The people who held the power to either put an end to this madness or let it fester. But as Kama read those words, she realized something even more disturbing. This wasn't just about her, or even the school anymore. There were higher stakes involved. The system was protecting its own. "They're on their way," Kama said aloud, her voice steady but carrying a note of urgency. "You can keep lying to me, but the truth is coming, whether you like it or not." Mr. Parker's face hardened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for the two men to step forward, their body language sending a clear message that this conversation was about to turn into something far more dangerous. Before anything could escalate further, the sharp click of heels echoed down the hallway, and a group of school administrators appeared in the doorway. The leader of the group was none other than Dr. Mitchell, the principal who had always been a ghost to Kama, untouchable, cold, and distant. "Kama," Dr. Mitchell's voice was icy, but there was a flicker of recognition behind her steely gaze. "I didn't expect to see you here. This isn't the place for students to be making such accusations." "I didn't ask for your approval," Kama shot back, her voice unwavering. "And if you think for one second that I'm going to let you sweep this under the rug again, you're wrong." The tension in the room thickened as Dr. Mitchell surveyed Kama, her eyes narrowing. "You've made a lot of noise, Kama, but noise isn't going to solve your problems. You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Kama's mind raced. The walls were closing in, but in that moment, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every student who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. "You think you control the truth," Kama said, her voice low but forceful. "But you don't, and you're about to find that out." Before anyone could respond, there was a loud knock on the door. A figure stepped into the room, her father. The man who had raised her, who had always been there to protect her, was here to stand beside her in this fight. "Kama," he said, his voice strong but filled with concern. "I came as soon as I heard. But I'm not here to protect you this time. I'm here to make sure they can't silence the truth." The room went deathly quiet. Kama's father had always been a pillar of strength, but his presence now carried more weight than ever. He wasn't just her father anymore. He was her ally, and he had the power to make sure their voices were heard. Dr. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, clearly rattled by the presence of someone who could challenge the establishment. "This is an internal matter," she said, her tone growing more defensive. "Your daughter has gone too far." But Kama's father wasn't backing down. "No, Dr. Mitchell, this is a matter of accountability. It's time for all of you to face the consequences of your actions." Kama felt a surge of confidence as she looked around the room, seeing not just the administrators, but the people who had allowed the lies to continue. The ones who had turned a blind eye to the cruelty that was being perpetrated right under their noses. "You're not untouchable," Kama said, her voice now a clear, defiant declaration. "And we're not going away." What will happen when the truth is laid bare and the lies are exposed? Don't miss Chapter 19, where Kama and her father take on the full force of the school's corruption and expose the dark secrets they've tried to bury for years. The truth doesn't just set you free, it makes you stronger, even in the face of your enemies. The tension in the room crackled with anticipation. Kama's heart raced, but her resolve had never been stronger. Standing beside her father, she knew that they were no longer just fighting for her. They were fighting for every student whose voice had been silenced, every person who had ever been crushed under the weight of the system. Dr. Mitchell's face twisted with irritation as she shot a glance at Mr. Parker and the two other men standing beside him. The air felt thick, oppressive, but Kama refused to let it break her. "You think you can change anything here?" Dr. Mitchell sneered, crossing her arms. "You're just a girl. What could you possibly know about how things work?" Kama's father took a step forward, his presence filling the room. "She knows more than you think, Dr. Mitchell. And the truth isn't something you can bury just because it doesn't fit your narrative." The school administrators exchanged uneasy glances, clearly feeling the weight of the moment. For the first time, it seemed like they were the ones who were cornered. Kama could feel the power shifting, but it wasn't hers to hold yet. Not until she exposed everything they tried to cover up. "I'm not asking for your permission," Kama said, her voice steady. "I'm telling you that you've failed every student in this school. You've failed me, and you've failed to do what's right." Mr. Parker stepped forward, his face reddening as he clenched his fists. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "You think the board will take your side? You're just a child making baseless accusations." "You're wrong," Kama said, her tone sharp and unwavering. "The board will hear everything, and you won't be able to hide behind your lies anymore." Her words were a spark in a room full of dry kindling, and it was clear to everyone in the room that things were about to erupt. Her father's voice rang out, firm and commanding. "If you think this is just about Kama, you're mistaken. This is about every student in this school who's been treated like they don't matter. It's about the years of manipulation, the bullying, and the way you've used your positions of power to intimidate everyone around you." Dr. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. She took a deep breath, her jaw tight as she considered her next move. "You don't understand the ramifications of this," she said coldly. "You're trying to destroy everything this school has worked for." Kama stepped forward, her eyes locked on Dr. Mitchell's. "What's this school really worked for, Dr. Mitchell? More lies? More intimidation? Or have you been working on how to sweep this under the rug, just like you've done before?" The door opened again, and this time, the school board members themselves walked in. 7 figures in business suits, each one carrying the weight of decisions that had long been kept behind closed doors. Kama's breath caught in her throat. These were the people who could finally bring about change, or reinforce the toxic cycle she had spent so long fighting. But in that moment, Kama realized something. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her future and the future of everyone else who had been forced to endure the same cruelty she had. Dr. Mitchell quickly approached the board members, clearly trying to salvage the situation. "There's been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice rising in a practiced tone. "Kama's accusations are exaggerated. She doesn't understand the gravity of what she's claiming." But before she could finish, one of the board members, an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, spoke up. "We've been receiving reports, Dr. Mitchell," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "And I think it's time we all have a conversation about what's been happening in this school. We're not here to sweep anything under the rug. We're here to make sure this place is safe for everyone." Kama felt a surge of hope, but she held her breath, waiting for the board to take action. Would they finally do the right thing? Or would they side with the powerful figures who had been holding this school hostage for so long? Another board member, a man in his 50s, turned toward Dr. Mitchell, his face pale with disbelief. "Are you telling us that you've allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked? That you've allowed this abuse to go on under your watch?" Dr. Mitchell's face flushed, and for a moment, She looked like a cornered animal. "This isn't what it seems," she stammered, her composure slipping. "I've always tried to do what's best for this school." The silver-haired board member raised a hand, cutting her off. "What's best for this school is accountability. It's time to address what's been happening here, and it's time to do it now." Kama looked to her father, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment where everything she had fought for, the late nights spent gathering evidence, the courage to stand in this room and face her accusers, was about to come to a head. The board members began to talk among themselves, but the tone had shifted. The power dynamics had shifted. Kama wasn't just a student anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with, and with her father by her side, she wasn't backing down. Will the school board take action and hold the perpetrators accountable? Or will the forces of power continue to crush those who stand up for the truth? Find out in Chapter 20, where Kama faces her final battle for justice. Will she see the change she's fought for, or is the fight just beginning? Justice doesn't come from what's written in the books. It comes from what we choose to stand for. The room grew quiet as the school board members conferred in hushed voices. Kama's heart pounded as she stood there, her eyes fixed on the group, her every nerve screaming for something. Anything that would confirm her fight was not in vain. Her father stood next to her, a solid presence, unwavering. They had come so far, but the final hurdle, the decision of the school board, loomed large, and it was still unclear which direction they would choose. Dr. Mitchell shifted uneasily, her eyes flicking toward Kama, then toward the board. The air was thick with the weight of this moment, and Kama could sense the shift in the room. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. The silver-haired woman, who had spoken earlier, was the first to break the silence. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. "We've heard the accusations, and we've seen the evidence. This is not something we can ignore." Kama felt a surge of relief mixed with anxiety. The board was listening. They were acknowledging the truth. But the true test would be what came next. Would they act on it? One of the younger board members, a man with a clipboard in hand, spoke up, his voice nervous but determined. This is serious. If these allegations are true, it could cost the district everything. But I don't think we can just pretend like nothing happened." The air seemed to crackle with the weight of the decision. Kama's father placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent reassurance. The board members were divided. Some wanted to act, others hesitated, but one thing was clear. They were all painfully aware that this moment would define the future of the school. Dr. Mitchell, clearly rattled, tried to regain control of the situation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she said, her voice rising in a last-ditch effort. "Kama's just a student. She doesn't know what it's like to run a school. She doesn't understand the pressures we face." Kama's jaw tightened. She wasn't going to let her diminish her fight anymore. "No, Dr. Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but full of fire. "What you don't understand is that it's not about running the school. It's about doing what's right. What you've done here is abuse your power. And no matter how much you try to defend it, the truth will come out. It's already out." Dr. Mitchell's face hardened, her eyes narrowing with malice. But there was no turning back now. Kama had exposed the truth, and there was no place for hiding it anymore. The board members turned toward each other, a tense murmur passing through them. Finally, the silver-haired woman stood again, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We have heard enough. It's time to make a decision." She paused, letting the silence stretch, her eyes locking with Kama's. This school has failed its students. It has failed to provide a safe environment. And now, it's time to make things right. Kama's breath caught in her throat. The moment of truth was here. Would they do what was necessary? Would they take a stand? Another board member, an older man with glasses, nodded slowly. "I agree. We cannot stand by and let this continue. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated." Kama's pulse raced, hope flooding her chest. This was it, the turning point she had been fighting for. The silver-haired woman addressed Dr. Mitchell. "Effective immediately, Dr. Mitchell, you are suspended pending an investigation into these matters. Mr. Parker, you will also be placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full review." Kama felt the weight of the words, but they were not just about victory. They were about justice, finally being served. Dr. Mitchell's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth to protest, but the silver-haired woman raised a hand to silence her. The truth is out, Dr. Mitchell. You no longer have control over this situation. Kama's father stood tall, a proud smile forming on his face as he placed a hand on her back. Thank you, he said to the board, his voice firm. You've done the right thing. Kama turned to look at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We did it, Dad. We really did it. Her father nodded, pulling her into a brief, tight hug. You did it, Kama. You're the reason this happened. But even as the weight of the victory settled over her, Kama knew this was just the beginning. This was a step towards something greater, not just for her, but for every student who felt powerless in the face of injustice. The door to the boardroom opened again, and as Kama and her father walked out into the hallway, they were met with a group of students, faces she recognized, who had been waiting anxiously for the outcome. When they saw her, they erupted into applause. But this wasn't just for Kama. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced, for everyone who had ever felt like they had no voice. Kama looked around at the faces in the crowd. Her fight hadn't been just for her. It was for all of them. And in that moment, she knew that they had all won. The battle is over, but the war for justice is far from finished. Will Kama's victory inspire others to take a stand? Or is this just the first chapter in an even greater story of change? Stay tuned for Chapter 21, where Kama begins her journey toward healing and finds new strength in her community. The real challenge is just beginning. Victory isn't just about winning. It's about understanding the strength it took to get there and the courage to keep going. The days following the school board's decision were a blur for Kama. There were phone calls to make, messages of congratulations to respond to, and endless questions about what came next. But amidst the whirlwind of activity, one thing was clear. She wasn't the same person who had walked into that room just a few short days ago. Her heart had been heavy with uncertainty, weighed down by the fear that speaking up wouldn't matter, that the system would protect those who had wronged her. But now, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the world beyond, she could breathe. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. Her father had been with her every step of the way, but now, it was time for Kama to find her own way forward. She knew she wasn't done yet. The fight she had started wasn't over. It was just beginning. I'm proud of you, Kama, her father said, his voice full of pride and something else, a kind of quiet sadness. But this will stay with you. You're going to have to find a way to move forward. Kama looked up at him, her eyes heavy with the weight of the truth. She had spent so long fighting for justice that she hadn't considered the emotional toll it would take. Her body ached, her spirit tired from the constant battle. But now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't stop. Not when there were so many others like her who needed someone to show them it was possible to stand up. I know, Dad, Kama said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm ready to heal. I'm ready to move forward. I have to. Her father's expression softened. It's not easy, Kama. Healing never is. Kama stood, walking to the window and gazing out at the quiet street. It was strange to think that the world outside had gone on as if nothing had changed. People were still going about their lives, unaware of the battle she had fought and won. But she knew, deep down, that things had changed, at least for her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned, surprised to see a familiar face standing on the other side. It was Mia, a friend from school who had stood by Kama through everything, someone who had watched her grow stronger with each passing day. Hey, Mia said, her voice tentative. I heard what happened. I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. Kama smiled, a small but genuine smile. Thanks, Mia. It feels weird, you know? Like everything's different now, but I don't know what comes next. Mia stepped inside, giving Kama a comforting hug. I get it, but you don't have to know what comes next right now. You've already done something amazing. You've shown everyone that one voice can make a difference. Kama nodded, feeling the weight of Mia's words settle in. It wasn't about knowing the next step. It was about finding the courage to take it, even when the path was unclear. As they sat down together, Mia looked at Kama with an intensity in her eyes that made Kama's heart skip a beat. You've started something big, Kama. You've changed things at school. People are talking. And it's not just about you anymore. It's about all the students who are going to feel safer because of what you did. Kama felt a swell of pride, but it was tempered by the realization that the fight for justice didn't end with Dr. Mitchell's suspension. There was so much more to be done. So much more work to be done to make sure that the system changed, that students like her weren't subjected to the same kind of treatment ever again. But for now, Kama allowed herself a moment of peace. She allowed herself to breathe. The road ahead would be long, but she wasn't afraid anymore. I'm not done, Mia, Kama said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. I'm just getting started. Mia grinned. I knew you'd say that. Together, they sat in the silence, the weight of the future hanging in the air. But Kama no longer felt burdened by it. She had the strength to carry it. The fight isn't over. Kama's journey to healing and change has just begun. Will she be able to heal from the scars of the past while continuing her mission for justice? Or will the emotional weight of her victory be too much to bear? Stay tuned for Chapter 22, where Kama finds unexpected allies in her mission to reform the school system. Her fight may have begun in her own heart, but it's about to expand to something much larger. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves. But it's the allies we find along the way that make it worth fighting. The morning after Mia's visit, Kama woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She was done resting. The road to healing wasn't one she could take sitting still, and there was still so much to do, so much to change. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the meetings she'd attended, the reports she'd heard, and the faces of the students who had come forward. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had suffered quietly, too afraid to speak up, too afraid to challenge the norms of a system that had failed them for so long. Kama's phone rang, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and smiled. It was Mr. Lawson, the school counselor who had been one of the first to listen when she came forward. He had supported her through the process, always there with advice and encouragement. It felt like he was more than just a counselor now. He was an ally, one of the few who had truly understood her struggle. Hey, Mr. Lawson, she answered, her voice steady but eager. Kama, I just wanted to check in with you. I know the meeting with the school board was intense, but I also know that you're not one to rest on your laurels. What's next for you? He asked, his tone warm and encouraging. Kama hesitated for a moment before responding. I don't know. I guess I'm still processing everything, but I know I can't stop here. There are other students out there, students who are going through what I did, and they need someone to stand up for them. Mr. Lawson was quiet for a moment, as though he were weighing his words carefully. I admire that, Kama. And you're right, there's more work to be done. But you're not in this alone. If you want, we can work together on a program to support other students. We can start a movement, something that could really change the way things are done at this school. Kama's heart quickened at the suggestion. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a lasting change. A system that wasn't just reactive, but proactive in addressing the needs of marginalized students. A system that wasn't afraid to listen. I'd love that, Kama said, her voice full of determination. I think we could make a real difference. But I don't want to do this alone. I want to get other students involved, make them feel like they're part of the change too. Absolutely, Mr. Lawson replied. I'll help you get the word out. We'll start by organizing a meeting for any students who want to get involved. The more voices we have, the more power we can bring to this cause. Kama felt a sense of relief wash over her. This was what she needed. Someone to stand beside her, to help her channel all the energy she had into something that could make a real, tangible difference. She had no idea where it would lead, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was on the right path. That afternoon, they sent out the invitations. A meeting was set for the following week. Kama knew it wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But she was ready. She was ready to build a community of students who weren't afraid to speak their truth, to stand up for one another, and to demand the respect they deserved. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Kama worked with Mr. Lawson, drafting a plan for the meeting, reaching out to trusted students, and building momentum. As the day of the meeting approached, she felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. What if no one showed up? What if the system pushed back too hard? But when the day arrived, Kama walked into the school auditorium to find it filled with students. They were a mix of races, genders, and backgrounds. Some of them were quiet, others outspoken, but they all had one thing in common: a shared belief that things needed to change. Kama stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. This was it. The moment where everything she'd been fighting for could either begin to take shape or fall apart. "I'm glad you're all here," she said, her voice steady, but filled with the passion that had fueled her from the very beginning. "This is bigger than just one person's story. It's about all of us. It's about creating a school that listens, that understands, and that treats every single student with respect." The room was silent, every student hanging on her words. Kama took a deep breath and continued, "I know we've all been hurt by this system, but we don't have to stay silent anymore. Together, we can create the change we need. We can make this school a place where everyone feels safe." A wave of emotion washed over Kama as the students began to clap, slowly at first, then growing louder. She knew they had heard her. She knew they were ready to fight alongside her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them, together, standing strong for what was right. Kama's journey to healing has led her to find unexpected allies. With Mr. Lawson's support and the strength of her peers, she's taking the next step in her mission for change. But will the fight ahead be easier than the one she's already won? Don't miss Chapter 23, where Kama and her new allies face their first major challenge. The system won't change overnight, and they'll have to navigate new obstacles if they want to make their voices heard. The truth is powerful, but it isn't always popular. Standing up for what's right comes with a price, but the cost of silence is far greater. Kama was on fire with a new sense of purpose. The meeting had been a success beyond her wildest dreams. Students had shown up, eager to join the cause. They had shared their stories, their frustrations, and their hopes for a school where they could feel safe and heard. It was the beginning of something much larger than herself. But with every victory, there was always resistance. As the days passed, Kama could feel the tension building. Teachers and administrators whispered in the hallways. There were rumors of students being disciplined for speaking out. Some of the more outspoken allies who had joined Kama's cause had begun to experience subtle forms of retaliation. Grades slipping, assignments disappearing, a sudden lack of attention from teachers who once encouraged them. Kama had seen this kind of resistance before. It was the system's way of fighting back, trying to shut down anything that challenged its comfort zone. But she wasn't about to let that stop her. One afternoon, as Kama walked into the school, she noticed a large, anonymous poster taped to a bulletin board near the entrance. It showed a picture of her, smiling in her school uniform, standing tall at the podium during the meeting. But the words below it were anything but complimentary. "Who do you think you are? Just another student with a complaint. Do us all a favor and stay quiet." It was a clear attack, a message designed to intimidate, to discredit her efforts. Kama felt her stomach twist, but she wasn't going to let this break her. Not this time. She immediately took a photo of the poster, making sure to capture the details before anyone could tear it down. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she pushed it down, focusing instead on her next move. After class, Kama met with her group of allies in a quiet corner of the cafeteria. As they gathered around, she showed them the photo of the poster. The room went silent, the weight of the attack settling over them like a dark cloud. "We can't let them get away with this," said Mia, a fierce ally who had quickly become one of Kama's closest friends through the process. "This is just the beginning. We need to stay strong. If they want to silence us, we need to turn the volume up." Kama nodded. "I'm not backing down. We need to make sure everyone knows we're serious. This isn't just about me. This is about every student who's been overlooked, every voice that's been ignored. We have the power to change things." The group was quiet for a moment, but it didn't take long for others to begin speaking up. Ideas flowed, from social media campaigns to flyers, to public demonstrations. Every person in the room had their own way of fighting back, and every idea seemed to build on the last. "Let's start by organizing a walkout," suggested Jordan, a student from her history class who had been quietly supportive but was now visibly more invested. "We all leave class at the same time. We don't cause a scene, but we show them we're not afraid. Kama smiled, feeling a spark of excitement. This was what it was all about, uniting and taking action. We'll do it, but we need to spread the word. And we need to make it clear that this isn't just a protest against the school. It's a message to anyone who thinks they can silence us. It's a declaration of our right to be heard. Over the next few days, Kama's group worked tirelessly. They designed posters and flyers, sent out messages to students, and prepared for the walkout. It wasn't going to be easy. It would be a risk, and there would be consequences. But they were ready to face them. This was their moment, and they weren't going to let fear dictate their actions. The day of the walkout arrived. Kama stood by the door to her first period class, heart pounding as students filed in. She saw the looks, some of support, others filled with uncertainty. Some students had already decided to join, and others still weren't sure. But the weight of the decision was in the air, palpable. By the time the bell rang for the second period, a small group of students had already gathered outside, waiting for the moment to walk out together. Kama's phone buzzed with messages of support, some from students she knew well, others from those she hadn't met but who had heard about the walkout and wanted to be part of it. At exactly 10 a.m., the group stood up, grabbed their bags, and filed out of their classrooms in unison. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. They weren't just walking out of class, they were walking out of silence. The halls filled with students leaving their classrooms, and by the time they gathered outside, Kama saw dozens of students waiting, some with signs, others with their fists raised. The energy was electric. This was bigger than a simple protest. It was the beginning of something much more significant. As the students gathered on the steps of the school, Kama stood in front of them, her voice strong and unwavering as she addressed the crowd. "We're here because we've been silent for too long," she said, her words echoing through the air. "We're here because we deserve to be heard. We deserve to be seen. And we're not going to let anyone make us feel invisible anymore." The crowd cheered, a wave of energy rippling through them. Kama had done it. She had taken the first step toward making real change. But the battle was far from over. The walkout has sent shockwaves through the school, but Kama knows that the hardest challenges are still ahead. Will the administration crack down on her and her fellow students, or will they find a way to push forward? Don't miss Chapter 24, where Kama faces the consequences of her actions and the resistance from those who want her to back down. Can she keep the movement alive, or will the system succeed in silencing her once and for all? They say you don't know how strong you are until being strong is your only choice. Kama sat in the principal's office, her heart pounding. The door was closed, and she could hear the muffled voices of the school administration on the other side, discussing the events of the walkout. She had been summoned there immediately after it happened, along with a few other students who had participated. No one had said a word as they were ushered into the room, just a cold silence that spoke volumes. The threat in the air was palpable, but Kama refused to let fear take hold of her. She had faced worse. The door finally opened, and Mr. Parker, the principal, stepped into the room. His usual stern expression was even more severe than usual. His eyes narrowed with frustration. "Kama," he began, his voice icy, "do you have any idea how disruptive your actions were today? You not only disrespected the teachers and the administration, but you also caused a major disruption to the entire school. There are consequences for this." Kama didn't flinch. She had expected this. She'd known they would try to intimidate her, to make her feel small, but she wouldn't back down. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice steady. "We've been silenced for too long, and we're not going to stay quiet anymore." Mr. Parker scoffed, clearly unamused. "You've made quite the spectacle of yourself. I understand your frustration, but there are proper ways to express it. This was nothing more than a tantrum, a childish stunt." Kama's hands balled into fists, but she forced herself to stay calm. It wasn't a stunt. It was a statement. And if you want to call it a tantrum, then maybe you should ask the students who've been ignored for years what they think. Maybe you should listen to us instead of lecturing us. The principal glared at her, and for a moment, the tension in the room felt unbearable. But Kama didn't back down. She had to stand firm. For herself, for the students who supported her, for everyone who had ever felt like their voice didn't matter. Mr. Parker opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a sharp knock came at the door. The assistant principal, Ms. Williams, stepped in, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Parker, I think we need to reconsider the severity of this situation. The students who walked out have a right to protest, and they were peaceful in doing so. I think we need to think carefully about how we respond," she said, her voice careful but firm. Kama turned to look at Ms. Williams, a flicker of hope in her chest. She had never expected the assistant principal to stand up for her, especially not in front of Mr. Parker. But Ms. Williams wasn't finished. "I've been in this school for years," she continued, "and I've seen things happen that should never have happened. If we're going to talk about respect and discipline, let's start with respect for our students. They have a right to voice their concerns." Mr. Parker's eyes narrowed, clearly not pleased with this interruption. But Ms. Williams stood her ground, unflinching. "I'm not saying we condone the walkout," she added, her voice now more resolute, "but we need to listen. We need to acknowledge that something has to change." For a moment, there was an uncomfortable silence in the room. Kama's heart raced. Had she actually found an ally in Ms. Williams? Could she count on her to help shift the balance? Mr. Parker's gaze flicked between the two women, clearly seething but unsure how to respond. Finally, he spoke, his voice forced. "We'll discuss this further," he said, before turning to Kama. "But don't expect me to go easy on you. There will be consequences." Kama stood up, feeling the weight of his words, but refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not afraid of consequences. I'm afraid of staying silent." As she left the room, her mind raced. The walkout had been just the beginning. If they thought this would silence her, they were wrong. The battle was far from over. But now, there was something she hadn't expected. A flicker of hope, a possible ally in Ms. Williams. Kama has faced the backlash, but her fight is far from finished. Will the support she's found be enough to change the tide, or will the forces against her prove too strong? Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Kama sat in the front row of the school board meeting, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with teachers, administrators, and parents, all watching as she prepared to speak. Today wasn't just about her. It was about every student who had ever felt unheard, overlooked, or ignored. She wasn't standing alone. The fight that had started with one person's quiet act of defiance had now grown into a movement, one that would not be silenced. The room buzzed with whispers as the board members took their seats, and Kama could feel the weight of their eyes on her. It was only a matter of time before she would be called to the front to give her statement. Her mind raced, going over everything she had prepared, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just about what she said. It was about what came after. This moment would change everything. The board chairperson, Mrs. Thomas, called the meeting to order. "We're gathered here today to address the recent walkout led by several students in protest of alleged mistreatment and discrimination at our school," she began, her voice clipped and professional. "We are here to hear both sides of the story and come to a fair resolution." Kama sat up straighter, feeling the tension in the air. This was it, her chance to make her case, not just for herself, but for all the students who had been voiceless for too long. When her name was called, she stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, but her resolve unshaken. As she walked to the front, she could hear the soft murmur of the crowd behind her. It was a strange feeling. Part of her wanted to shrink away, but she knew she couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. Taking a deep breath, she faced the board, her eyes steady. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here today because I refuse to let what happened to me, and to many others, be swept under the rug. For years, students like me have been treated as if our voices don't matter, as if our experiences don't count." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. Some faces looked uncomfortable, others indifferent, but there were a few nods of agreement from students and even a couple of teachers. It was a small victory, but it gave her the strength to continue. "When I walked out of that classroom," she said, her voice rising with emotion, "I wasn't just protesting one teacher's actions. I was protesting an entire system that has allowed racism, bias, and discrimination to thrive. And I won't stand by and let it happen anymore." Kama could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she refused to look away. This was her moment to be heard. I know it's not easy to hear, but it's time for the truth to come out. It's time for us to be honest about what's been going on behind these walls. And it's time for real change. We can't keep pretending that things are fine when so many of us have been hurt. We can't keep pretending that silence is an answer, because silence only protects those who want to keep things the way they are. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, and Kama could see a few board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. She pressed on. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for equality. I'm asking for a fair chance. We deserve to feel safe here. We deserve to be treated with respect. And we deserve to have our voices heard. There was a long pause. The room was still, as if holding its breath. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke up, Ms. Williams. Kama had no idea what was coming, but she knew this was her ally. I stand with Kama, Ms. Williams said firmly, her voice ringing out with authority. And I stand with every student who has ever felt unheard or unseen. We, as educators, have a responsibility to ensure that all students feel safe, valued, and heard. It's time for us to take a hard look at how we've been failing them. Kama's heart soared at the sight of Ms. Williams stepping forward, offering her support so publicly. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a collective effort to bring about real change. The room was silent for a moment, but then another teacher, Mrs. Peterson, spoke up. I agree, she said softly, but with growing confidence. I've seen what's been happening, and I've been silent for too long. It's time to take action. Kama's eyes welled up with tears. She had known she couldn't do this alone, but hearing the support from people like Ms. Williams and Mrs. Peterson made all the difference. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was everyone's fight. The board members exchanged glances, clearly shaken by the momentum building in the room. Mrs. Thomas, the chairperson, cleared her throat. We will review the allegations and take appropriate action, she said, her tone less certain than before. We will work with the administration to ensure that our school is a safe and welcoming environment for all students. Kama's pulse raced. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. She nodded, knowing this was just the beginning. As she walked back to her seat, she glanced over at Ms. Williams, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. Kama smiled back, feeling the weight of everything she had fought for. She had made it this far, and no matter what came next, she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't stop until the change they needed was real. Kama's journey is just one example of what happens when you stand up for what's right. Are you ready to take action and make your voice heard? Thank you for joining Kama on her journey of resilience, courage, and justice. Keep fighting for what's right.